Story 1. It was just past midnight when I left my friend's house in rural Oregon. The drive back to Portland should have taken about 3 hours, but what happened that night still haunts me to this day. About an hour into my journey, I noticed the road signs becoming unfamiliar. I chalked it up to my tired mind playing tricks on me, but as I continued driving, an unsettling feeling crept over me. The wilderness seemed denser, darker, and the few cars I'd seen earlier had disappeared entirely. Suddenly, my radio started crackling with static. I fiddled with the dial, but every station was the same. That's when I noticed the time on my dashboard, 1:37 a.m. I'd been driving for over an hour, but it felt like mere minutes had passed. Deciding to turn around, I slowed down to make a U-turn. As I did, my headlights illuminated something that made my blood run cold. The road behind me had vanished, replaced by an impenetrable wall of trees. Panicking, I accelerated forward, hoping to find the next exit or turnoff. The road stretched endlessly before me, unchanging. Hours seemed to pass, yet my gas gauge never moved. The trees on either side began to blur, creating a tunnel-like effect. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Just as despair was setting in, I saw a figure standing on the roadside ahead. As I approached, I realized it was an elderly Native American man. He stood perfectly still, his eyes locked on mine as I slowed to a stop beside him. Without a word, he opened my passenger door and got in. "You've strayed onto the spirit road," he said, his voice like gravel. "It appears when the veil between worlds is thin. Keep driving until you see 3 white deer. Then close your eyes and count to 13. Before I could respond, he vanished. I blinked hard, convinced I was hallucinating from exhaustion. But then, in the distance, I saw them. 3 white deer standing in the middle of the road, their eyes gleaming in my headlights. Heart pounding, I did as the old man instructed. I closed my eyes and counted to 13. When I opened them, I was parked on the shoulder of Interstate 5, just outside Portland. My clock read 4:03 a.m., exactly 3 hours after I'd left my friend's house. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. I've driven that route countless times since, but I've never encountered that strange, endless road again. Sometimes when I'm driving late at night, I swear I catch a glimpse of those white deer in my rearview mirror, reminding me of the night I got lost on a highway that shouldn't exist. Story 2. When my grandmother passed away, I inherited her old Victorian house in New England. It was a beautiful property, but it needed work, so I took a sabbatical from my job to renovate it myself. Little did I know that decision would lead me to question everything I believed about reality. It started with the whispers. At first, I dismissed them as the house settling or the wind whistling through cracks in the old windows. But as the days went by, the whispers became clearer, more insistent. They seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, but I could never quite make out what they were saying. One night, unable to sleep due to the constant murmuring, I decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight and a hammer, I followed the sound to a small room on the 3rd floor. The whispers grew louder as I approached, almost frantic in their urgency. I tapped the walls, listening for hollow spots. Near the back of the room, I heard it, a different, emptier sound. Without hesitation, I swung the hammer, creating a small hole in the plaster. The whispers immediately ceased. Peering through the hole with my flashlight, I saw something that defied explanation. Instead of wooden beams and insulation, I saw what looked like an endless, swirling vortex of colors and shapes. It pulsed with an otherworldly energy, and I felt a strong urge to reach out and touch it. Just as my fingers were about to breach the hole, I heard my grandmother's voice clear as day. "Not yet, dear. It's not your time." Startled, I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet and hitting my head on the floor. When I came to, sunlight was streaming through the windows. Disoriented, I looked at the wall where I'd made the hole, but it was intact. No sign of damage, no swirling vortex, nothing out of the ordinary. Convinced I'd dreamed the whole thing, I went about my day. But that night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard it again, the faintest whisper saying, "Soon." Over the next few weeks, I tore that room apart, searching for any evidence of what I'd seen. I found nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself it had all been a vivid dream, brought on by stress and lack of sleep. Years passed, and I all but forgot about that strange night. I finished renovating the house and made it my home, starting a family of my own. But sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear those whispers. And every now and then, when I pass by that room on the third floor, I feel a gentle tug, as if something beyond our world is calling out to me. I've never told anyone about what happened that night. Who would believe me? But I know that somewhere in this house, hidden behind the walls of reality, there's a doorway to somewhere else. And someday, when the time is right, I have a feeling I'll be invited to step through. Story 3. As a freelance photographer, I've captured countless moments over the years. But there's one photo I'll never forget, the one that shouldn't exist. It was a crisp autumn day, and I was hiking through a state park, looking for the perfect shot of the fall foliage. As I crested a hill, I saw an old weathered cabin nestled among the trees. It was picturesque, exactly the kind of scene I'd been hoping to find. I set up my tripod and framed the shot carefully. Just as I was about to press the shutter, I noticed movement in one of the cabin's windows. Curious, I zoomed in with my lens. What I saw made my heart skip a beat. A young woman in old-fashioned clothing was staring directly at me. Her expression was one of utter terror, her mouth open in a silent scream. Behind her, I could make out the blurry shape of a man, his arm raised as if to strike. Without thinking, I snapped the photo and ran toward the cabin, determined to help. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. The cabin, which had looked so solid moments ago, now appeared dilapidated and abandoned. The windows were boarded up, the roof partially caved in. Confused, I circled the structure, looking for any sign of the woman or her attacker. Finding nothing, I reluctantly headed back to my car, my mind racing with possibilities. Had I imagined it all? When I got home, I immediately uploaded the photos from my camera to my computer. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through the images, searching for the cabin shot. And there it was, but not as I remembered it. The photo showed the cabin exactly as I'd seen it up close. Old, abandoned, falling apart. There was no sign of the woman or the man in the window. I zoomed in, adjusted the contrast, tried every trick I knew, but the image remained unchanged. Desperate for answers, I returned to the park the next day. I found a ranger and asked about the cabin's history. His response chilled me to the bone. "Oh, that old place? It's been abandoned for decades. Legend has it that back in the 1920s, a young woman was murdered there by her husband. Some hikers say they've seen her ghost in the windows, still trying to escape. But that's just a local ghost story, you know?" I nodded numbly, thanked him, and walked away. I've never told anyone what I saw that day. The photo on my computer shows nothing unusual, just an old abandoned cabin in the woods. But I know what I saw through my lens in that moment. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself staring at that photo, searching for any hint of the woman in the window. And sometimes, just for a second, I swear I can see her eyes looking back at me, pleading for help that will never come. Story 4. I've worked in the same office building for over a decade, but what happened last month has me questioning everything I thought I knew about my workplace and reality itself. It was a typical Monday morning. I was running late, so I rushed into the first available elevator, jabbing the button for the 14th floor repeatedly. Just as the doors were closing, a hand shot through the gap, forcing them open again. A man in a pristine white suit stepped in. I'd never seen him before, which was odd because I knew most of the people who worked in our building. He nodded politely but didn't press a button. As we ascended, I noticed something strange. The numbers on the display were changing faster than usual, and they weren't in the right order. 3 dots, 7, 12, 19. Wait, our building only had 20 floors. Before I could say anything, the elevator lurched to a stop at what the display claimed was floor 27. The doors slid open, revealing a sight that made my jaw drop. Instead of an office, I saw a vast, misty expanse stretching out before me. Floating islands dotted the landscape, connected by impossible bridges that seemed to defy gravity. The sky was a swirling mass of purples and greens, like an aurora borealis gone mad. The man in the white suit stepped out, turned to me, and smiled. "This isn't your floor," he said calmly, as if this were a perfectly normal occurrence. The doors began to close. Panicking, I jabbed at the buttons, trying to make the elevator go back down. Nothing happened. The display continued to show impossible numbers as I felt the elevator rising higher and higher. Just as I was about to completely lose it, the elevator dinged and the doors opened. I was back on the 14th floor, my floor, as if nothing had happened. My colleagues were milling about, starting their day as usual. Shaken, I made my way to my desk. As I booted up my computer, I noticed the time. 9:05 a.m. I'd entered the elevator at 8:57. Somehow, I'd lost 8 minutes. Over the next few weeks, I tried to find any information about the man in the white suit or the strange floor I'd seen. I asked my coworkers if they'd experienced anything unusual in the elevators, but they all looked at me like I was crazy. I even went to building management, asking about the possibility of hidden floors or elevator malfunctions. They assured me that everything was in perfect working order and that there were definitely no floors above the 20th. To this day, I take the stairs. Sometimes when I pass the elevators, I swear I can hear a faint, otherworldly humming coming from behind the doors. And every now and then, out of the corner of my eye, I catch a glimpse of a man in a white suit, smiling knowingly as he steps into an elevator that I know leads to places that shouldn't exist. Story 5. I've always been a bit of a tech junkie, constantly tinkering with gadgets and electronics. So when I stumbled upon an old Art Deco-style radio at a garage sale, I couldn't resist buying it. Little did I know that this seemingly innocuous purchase would turn my life upside down. At first, the radio worked like any other. I could tune into local stations, enjoying a mix of music and talk shows. But one night, as I was falling asleep with the radio on low volume, I heard something that made me sit bolt upright. The radio was announcing, in perfect detail, events from my day. It described conversations I'd had, down to the exact words used. It mentioned the sandwich I'd eaten for lunch and the color of the shirt worn by the barista who'd served me coffee. Thinking I must be dreaming, I switched off the radio and tried to sleep. But the next night it happened again. This time the radio wasn't just recounting past events, it was predicting my future. It told me I would receive a call from my sister at 10:17 a.m. the next day, that I would narrowly avoid a car accident on my way to work, and that my boss would announce budget cuts during our team meeting. To my astonishment, every prediction came true. Excited and terrified by the radio's power, I began to rely on it. I'd listen each night, adjusting my plans based on its predictions. I avoided bad days at work, knew exactly when to invest in stocks, and even prevented a friend's accident by warning her based on the radio's forecast. But as the weeks went by, I noticed a disturbing pattern. The future the radio predicted was becoming increasingly bleak. It spoke of natural disasters, economic collapse, and personal tragedies. And no matter what I did to try and change these outcomes, they always came to pass. One night, the radio told me that in exactly 1 month, I would die in a house fire. Panic-stricken, I fled my home, checked into a hotel, and spent the next week researching fire prevention methods. But as the predicted date approached, I realized something. In trying to avoid the fate the radio had laid out for me, I'd stopped living my life. I'd become a puppet, dancing to the tune of an inexplicable force I didn't understand. On the night I was supposed to die, I returned to my home. I took the radio out to my backyard, placed it on the ground, and smashed it to pieces with a hammer. As I did, I swear I heard it whisper, "Finally." I never bought another radio after that. I've learned to appreciate the uncertainty of life, the not knowing what comes next. Sometimes when I'm about to make a decision, I feel a pull, as if the ghost of that radio is trying to guide me. But I resist. After all, the future isn't set in stone, unless we believe it is. To this day, I can't explain where that radio came from or how it worked. Was it some kind of advanced technology, a portal to alternate timelines, or something even stranger? I'll never know for sure, but I do know this. Sometimes it's better not to know what the future holds. Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. Story 6. I've always been fascinated by mirrors. As a child, I'd spend hours staring into them, imagining worlds beyond the glass. But I never thought those childish fantasies would come true in the most terrifying way possible. It started on my 30th birthday. I just moved into a new apartment, and my parents gifted me an antique full-length mirror. It was beautiful, with an ornate golden frame that seemed to shimmer in the light. I placed it in my bedroom, admiring how it opened up the space. That night, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed something odd in the mirror. For a split second, I could have sworn my reflection smiled at me before I did. I blinked and everything was normal again. Chalking it up to birthday wine and exhaustion, I went to sleep. Over the next few weeks, these little inconsistencies kept happening. My reflection would be wearing slightly different clothes, or its hair would be styled differently. Once I saw a bruise on my reflection's arm that wasn't on my own. Each time, if I looked away and back quickly, everything would return to normal. I started avoiding the mirror, covering it with a sheet when I slept. But curiosity got the better of me. One night, I sat in front of the mirror, determined to catch my reflection in the act. Hours passed and nothing happened. Just as I was about to give up, I saw it. My reflection stood up while I remained seated. Heart pounding, I watched as it walked to my bedroom door and opened it. But in the real world, my door remained closed. Panicking, I reached out to touch the mirror. To my shock, my hand went straight through as if the glass were water. Without thinking, I plunged my arm in up to the elbow. It felt cold on the other side, and I could feel what seemed like a breeze. Suddenly, something grabbed my wrist. My reflection, grinning maliciously, began to pull me into the mirror. I fought back, bracing myself against the frame, but it was incredibly strong. Just as I thought I was going to be dragged through, I managed to yank my arm free, falling backward onto the floor. Gasping for breath, I looked up at the mirror. My reflection stood there, no longer mimicking me. It looked angry, pounding soundlessly on the glass. Then, to my horror, I saw other figures approaching in the mirror world, twisted, shadowy versions of people I knew. I threw the sheet over the mirror and ran out of my apartment. I spent the night in a hotel, trying to convince myself it had all been a nightmare. But when I returned home the next day, I knew it had been real. The mirror was cracked, with what looked like handprints pressed against the inside of the glass. I got rid of the mirror that day, leaving it at a donation center across town. Sometimes I wonder if I should have destroyed it, but I couldn't bring myself to risk releasing whatever was on the other side. Since then, I've researched obsessively, looking for similar stories. I've found a few, tales of mirrors that don't quite reflect reality, of people seeing things that shouldn't be there. Some cultures believe mirrors are portals to other worlds. After what I experienced, I'm inclined to agree. I've replaced all the mirrors in my home with non-reflective surfaces. I avoid mirrors in public as much as possible, because now I know the truth. Our reflections are not always our own, and sometimes the things on the other side want to come through. Every now and then, when I catch a glimpse of myself in a store window or a rearview mirror, I watch my reflection carefully. So far, it's behaved normally, but I can't shake the feeling that somewhere, in some mirror world, another version of me is waiting for a chance to switch places. And next time, it might succeed. Story 7, I found Cafe Kronos entirely by accident. I was hurrying through an unfamiliar part of the city, late for a job interview, when the heavens opened up. Desperate to avoid getting soaked, I ducked into the nearest doorway. The cafe was unlike anything I'd seen before. It had an old-world charm, with Art Nouveau posters on the walls and a gleaming brass espresso machine behind the counter. The air smelled of coffee and something else I couldn't quite place. A hint of ozone, like the air after a lightning strike. An elderly man with kind eyes greeted me from behind the counter. "Welcome to Cafe Kronos," he said, his voice warm and inviting. "What year would you like your coffee from?" I laughed, thinking it was a joke. 2023 is fine, I replied, playing along. He nodded seriously and set to work. As I waited, I noticed the other patrons. Their clothes seemed off, vintage, but not in a hipster way. More like they had stepped out of different eras. When the barista handed me my coffee, I nearly dropped it. The cup was warm, but the liquid inside was steaming as if freshly brewed. "Enjoy your 2023 blend," he said with a wink. I took a sip and gasped. It was the best coffee I'd ever tasted, but that wasn't what shocked me. As the liquid touched my lips, the world around me seemed to blur. For a moment, I saw flashes of the future. Sleek buildings, advanced technology, things I couldn't even begin to describe. Disoriented, I stumbled to a table. The woman seated next to me smiled. She was dressed in clothes that would have been fashionable in the 1960s. "First time, dear?" she asked kindly. "It can be a bit overwhelming." Over the next hour, she explained everything. Café Kronos existed in a sort of temporal bubble. The coffee was actually brewed in different time periods and served here, where past, present, and future intersected. The patrons were a mix of regulars from various eras and accidental visitors like myself. Some, she said, had been coming here for centuries, sipping coffee from their favorite years and chatting with people from across time. As closing time approached, though I'm not sure that concept truly applied here, I realized I had completely forgotten about my interview, but somehow it didn't seem to matter anymore. I've been back to Café Kronos many times since that day. I've had coffee from years I've lived through, years long past and years yet to come. I've conversed with people from the Renaissance, the distant future, and everywhere in between. But here's the strangest part. No matter how hard I try, I can never find the cafe when I'm looking for it. It only appears when I'm not expecting it, usually when I'm lost or in need of shelter. And I can never remember exactly where it was once I leave. I've tried to tell others about Café Kronos, but the words always seem to fall short. I can describe the decor, the smell, the taste of the coffee, but I can never quite capture the essence of what it's like to sit in a place where time has no meaning. Sometimes I wonder if it's all an elaborate hallucination, but then I'll catch a whiff of that distinctive ozone smell, or I'll see someone on the street wearing clothes that don't quite fit this era, and I know somewhere out there, Café Kronos is waiting, a place where the past, present, and future swirl together like cream and coffee, and where, for a little while at least, you can escape the relentless march of time. So if you're ever caught in an unexpected storm and find yourself ducking into a strange little cafe, pay attention. You might just have stumbled upon the most remarkable coffee shop in all of history and the future.
Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.